Welcome to History from a New Perspective, a new history channel and podcast covering the history and historical stories from parts of the world which don't always get as much attention. My name is Joseph Keane, and today we'll be looking at the history of the Aztecs. Now, the Aztec Empire lasted until the 16th century in the country that is now Mexico, with the Spanish conquest eventually leading to its collapse in 1521. Now, scholars have traditionally relied on European sources to document their history, but how did the Aztecs see their history from their own perspective? Well, the book Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs, uses indigenous sources to tell their story. I've been speaking to the book's author, Professor Camilla Townsend, who is a Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University. I first started by asking her who the Aztecs were.
There never were any Aztecs. Now, that may sound silly, especially coming from someone who wrote a book about them, but no people on Earth ever called themselves Aztecs. The term was essentially invented by European scholars in the 1700s and early 1800s. They needed a word to talk about the people who had been in power in Mexico when Hernán Cortés got there. The people who ruled at that time called themselves the Mexica, spelled Mexica with an X. So in other words, that word had come to be the name of the whole country by the time these scholars were writing, Mexico. So to start calling these people the Mexicans was going to be extremely confusing for everybody. So they needed a word, and they found in some of the old texts that had been written by the Mexica that their ancestors had been called the Azteca. So they seized on this word and started referring to the Aztecs. So it's probably better if we talk about the Mexica or the people of Tlaxcala or the people of Cuernavaca. But the truth is, even today, we need a word, to talk about the collectivity of people who were there and who, engaged with the Spaniards, met them in battle and lost.
And just tell me a bit about their ancestral origins and the world they eventually came to live in, which is in modern-day Mexico.
One thing we could call all of these people actually is Nahuas. It means speakers of the language Nahuatl. And the Nahuatl language family is referred to as the Utah Aztecan language family because it runs from the Utes up in today's Utah, the Native Americans there, all the way down close to El Salvador, all the way through Mexico. It's a kind of like the Romance language family. It includes many languages, but they're all tightly interrelated. And all of these people who were that we think of as Aztecs or their neighbors were Nahuas, speakers of Nahuatl. They had all come down from the north, from the upper regions of where this language family exists, so from the southwest of today's United States. The Utes, the Hopi, and other southwestern Native Americans have common ancestors with the Aztecs. Some of them stayed up there in the future American Southwest, and some of them came wandering down, south into Mexico, because they had heard, beginning after the 900s, that there was a power vacuum down there. And indeed, there was. There had been a preceding very powerful city-state, Teotihuacan. It's the ruins of it are still there, by the way, an incredibly impressive archaeological site. If you're ever in Mexico City, take the 1 or 2 hour bus ride to Teotihuacan. So these people came down in different sort of migratory groups, and some of them were the Mexica, who later became the Aztecs. Some of them were the Tlaxcalans. Some of them were the people of Quotinchan. All of these people spoke Nahuatl. They all interacted with each other once they arrived in central Mexico, and frankly fought with each other until an empire was established, and even then somewhat. They also interacted with the people who had lived previously in central Mexico, and they were mostly farmers. The people coming down from the American Southwest were warriors, hunters, gatherers, migrating peoples par excellence. The people who had lived for millennia in central Mexico were farmers. They were the America's first farmers. They farmed corn and beans, and they could live on that.
And tell us a bit about the sources you used in your book, Fifth Son. These were in their own language, Nahuatl. So what time period were they written in?
We tend to tell ourselves a kind of a story, which is that the Native Americans did not write, except for the Mayas who had their epigraphy. But that's not entirely true. The Aztecs, or the Nahuas, the people of central Mexico, had a pictographic system. The problem was that after the conquest by the Spaniards, only priests were trained to read it, and it wasn't phonetic. So you would see, say, a burning temple, and you would know, oh, that's my cue to talk about the people who built that temple's their loss in a war. Their temple is burning. It's an illustration that they lost the war. So kind of a mnemonic device system. And after the conquest, the priests who could read these symbols, who knew what these symbols were supposed to elicit, began to die off from various diseases. But right at that same time, in the 1500s, the newly arrived Spaniards began to teach the Roman alphabet, our alphabet, primarily so that the young Nahuatl-speaking students could learn to read the Bible and could help proselytize their neighbors. But what these young kids, mostly kids, teenage boys mostly, although some young adults too, what they did, they did their homework for the friars. They were good students, but they also took the alphabet home with them and used it to write down what their great uncle or their grandmother said. So they would say, for instance, oh, Grandma, tell me the prayer that you used to pray. And she might begin to speak, and then they would write this down, transliterating, putting it down in their own language, but using the Roman letters. So, for example, today we have surviving, existing hundreds of pages in our letters that recount their histories, their prayers, their stories, etc. Again, much of this dictated way away from the presence of the Spaniards. The Spaniards didn't even know this stuff was being written down. So you may wonder, why hasn't more been done with this? I mean, you have to learn Nahuatl to read it, but you would think, given our hunger for non-Western histories, more would have been done before now. The problem is you do have to learn Nahuatl, and even then, they weren't written for us. There are other sources that are easier to read that are in Nahuatl, because, for example, there's a famous text called the Florentine Codex, and they're easier to read because they were written hand in hand with Europeans. So a European asked a Nahuatl person, tell me about the gods, tell me about the birds, tell me about this or that. And they would write this down, and it became the Florentine Codex. And it's very much like a European encyclopedia. So we can understand it, us Westerners, right? Whereas when they were writing down what grandma said in the privacy of their own home, it wasn't written for us. It was done in their own style, in their own way. So it's been a question of enough people learning Nahuatl and then learning the old ways. Now, you might say, why didn't we just ask native speakers? Because there are still over 1 million people who speak Nahuatl. And we have, and we do, and they are now joining us. The problem is, even people who speak Nahuatl in Mexico or who have migrated to the United States or to UK haven't learned to read and write in it. It's a heritage language that they speak. It's not something they read and write in. So it hasn't always been the easiest thing for them to look at a page of writing from the 1500s and just read it. Add to that it's a style of speaking from the 1500s. But now many indigenous people are also becoming scholars and are joining the non-indigenous scholars. And of course, they do have insights because they are native speakers of the language. So we're making progress fast. And I think that explains why it's only recently that we've been able to do the Aztecs' history from their own point of view, do it the way they would want it done, rather than getting it all from Spanish sources or from the little bits of archaeological remains that we have.
So from your research, what were you able to find out about the way they saw the world they lived in and a bit about their belief systems?
You've hit the nail on the head. That is, what you really learn is learn more about, to a far greater extent, is their belief system. How did they see the world? I think some people have been disappointed that we didn't learn about a whole new set of events. And we do learn about some events that we didn't know about from the Europeans, but they don't change the whole, story of the conquest. What it changes is our understanding of their understanding, which is, of course, part of why, what explains the conquest. Sort of, some people have said, oh, they thought the white men were gods. Well, there's nothing in their sources that indicates at all that they thought the white men were gods. So we learn to understand or interpret what happened better than we have before. It's not like it's a surprise to us that they were conquered. It's not the facts or the events that are new, but our understanding of them. We come, when you read these sources, you begin to see them more as real people. You stop thinking that they're worshiping any other human beings. You hear them make jokes and laugh. You don't expect Aztecs are supposed to be cutting people's hearts out and chomping on them for breakfast. They're supposed to be savage beasts, and in terms of what we've been taught. You don't expect them to make sensitive comments, to respect women, to start to laugh and make a joke. But those are the people that come through when you read what they wrote for themselves, rather than what Spaniards either thought or wanted other people to believe, because the Spaniards had their own propaganda to write. They needed to explain and make it acceptable to the whole wide world why they had, and how they had conquered these people.
We have this idea of the Aztecs engaging in human sacrifice. From your research, what are some of the truths and misconceptions we have?
It is certainly true that at the heart of Aztec religion, there did exist human sacrifice. However, I would be quick to point out that at the heart of most human religions, on some level, if you go back far enough, there exists a tradition of human sacrifice. I mean, the whole story of Jesus Christ, the blood and the host, it's at the root. The idea that a truly good young man, especially usually a young man, will give his life for his people, is a very powerful notion, and it is part of most religions. So I would just lay that out there. But still, nevertheless, it was still going on in the 1500s among the Aztecs. That is real. What happened is that at first Westerners loved this idea because it justified conquest. They needed to be conquered. They needed to be stopped from doing this. So for several hundred years, they were painted as actual monsters, doing this to tens of thousands of people per month. And, as I joked before, chomping on their hearts for breakfast. Then in the 1960s and 70s, some very sensitive and serious Mexican scholars began to realize how preposterous this was, and they wanted to rescue the Aztecs from this bad reputation. But in order to do that, not having read many of the Nahuatl sources that had been written for Nahuas, they made up another myth, which is this idea that these were very devout, holy people who truly believed that the universe would end tomorrow if they did not kill dozens and dozens of people. And so they were only doing what they had to do. It was a respectful and religious act. Now, there's some truth to that, but it accepts the idea that they really were killing, dozens of people every day, and there's no evidence for that. And it also is premised on the idea that all Aztecs could easily be convinced of the same idea, and were willing to kill, dozens of people every day because they were so almost maniacally convinced of the same idea. And that's rather dehumanizing. Again, these scholars were not trying to dehumanize anyone. They were just dealing with this story of the past, but they created another story, which is really problematic. So what the sources actually tell us, and this had been batted around by scholars before, but I think now we can see what the Aztecs were saying. They're pretty clear that this did not exist amongst the Aztecs any more than it did among any other people. That is, an occasional prisoner of war was sacrificed. It rose over the course of the century in which the Aztecs were in power to become a more brutal practice as part of a particular royal family, a particular government's efforts to remain in power. And they did some draconian things. And what they said in these sources was that they were doing it to terrify their enemies so that they would have enough power so that they themselves would never be attacked and killed again. Because the Mexica had actually started as rather weak and vulnerable people who experienced a great deal of death themselves in the battlefield. We had a coterie of guys doing what they needed to do to maintain power, both for themselves and for their nation state, for the Aztecs. And then most people going along with it, although I will say many of the artists, the poets, the singers, in the lyrics of their surviving songs bemoan death, and wish that they could, find a way to live more life and not kill. So there was a variety of thought. There were different opinions within their worlds, just as there are in ours.
Take us to 1519 when the Spanish arrive, and tell us a bit about Hernán Cortés and Malintzin, and why the Spanish actually decided to land in Mexico.
It's funny, we all think about Cortés in 1519, but when you think back, In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So, in fact, the Spaniards had been in the Caribbean since the 90s, right? It says the Spaniards had been exploring, for more than a generation, and were well aware that there was a mainland over there, and had high hopes that there would be rich sedentary cultures living on that mainland. And in fact, some of the indigenous people that they had interacted with on the coast had told them that there were. So Cortés was just doing what, in fact, many Spaniards coming out of the Caribbean were doing. That is, trying to find, the richest, most powerful indigenous kingdom that they could possibly conquer there on the mainland. He was actually the third serious expedition to touch on the Mexican coast, and there had been others that had sort of unintentionally done so, or who had shipwrecked on the edge of it. And he got lucky, basically. Early on, he found a former shipwreck victim, a Spaniard who had washed ashore in Mayan country and had lived there for 8 or 9 years and spoke Mayan. And then, after a quick battle with some other Mayans that the Spaniards had won, they were offered 20 indigenous women, enslaved girls, as a kind of a peace offering. And among them was this young woman named Malintzin, who had been born in Nahuatl-speaking territory. She was not an Aztec. She was from another culture group, but they did speak Nahuatl. As they approached the Aztec city, they could do it as follows. Someone there could speak Nahuatl, okay, and Malintzin, who had been born in a Nahuatl-speaking territory, could understand. And she, who had also been imprisoned by the Mayans, could then translate it into a Chontal Mayan. And the Spanish castaway, who had also been imprisoned among the Mayan, could understand her, and then he could turn around and say it in Spanish to Hernando Cortés. So Cortés was lucky to have come across these two people, although I will say there were plenty of enslaved young women who were multilingual, and if it hadn't been Cortés, it would have been someone else. And there were plenty of other castaways or Spaniards, young boys who could even be left to learn the language. So this would have happened, but Cortés was lucky in that it happened to him. And with this translation chain, he was able to make his way up to Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Mexica, the capital of the Aztec Empire.
So Cortés arrives at Tenochtitlan. What happens then? And how did it lead to the eventual defeat of the Aztec Empire?
There are different stories that are told, but Cortés later, much later, said something that he kind of had to say. He said, much later, that the Mexica or Aztec Emperor Moctezuma, the same Montezuma that we've all heard of, that he had voluntarily and immediately relinquished his kingdom to the Spanish king through Cortés. Now, it was an English scholar, John Eliot, who recently passed away, who figured out what was going on there. By the time Cortés said that, the Spaniards were busy fighting the Aztecs, who were, making war as hard as they could because they didn't want to be conquered. And it was illegal, even in medieval Spain, just as it is now, by all understandings of international law. You can't just walk into another country and say, I'm going to conquer you and you have to accept it, right? But you can put down rebels, right? That's perfectly justified. So Cortés needed to say these people had originally immediately joined the Spanish Empire, so that by the time now that they were fighting them, it was a legitimate or just war because now they're putting down rebels. In fact, the other Spaniards and the Nahuatl language sources do not say that Moctezuma, who was a 17-year successful monarch, immediately gave his kingdom as a gift to the Spaniards. That makes no sense, except, interpreting it the way Sir John Eliot did. So what really happened, it seems, is that Cortés and the Spaniards lived as honored guests. Now, some people have thought Moctezuma must have been a fool to let them in, but in fact, he had spies out. We know from the Nahuatl sources that he had people coming and going, really kind of like a war room. He knew all the time what the Spaniards were doing as they made their way from the coast. And so he had reports of battles that the Spaniards had waged against the Mayas and against other Nahuatl-speaking peoples. And he had learned that with their crossbows, their long spears, their horses, their armor, that a few hundred men could do devastating damage against a few thousand indigenous people. So it seems likely, almost obvious to me, that he was doing damage control. He could not afford to lose or even tie in a big battle close to home. He's the head of the effing world, right? Okay. He had to be powerful. What he could afford to do is let them in and have talks and work it out. He probably assumed, and there's indigenous evidence, in the indigenous sources, there's evidence that he wanted to figure out how much tribute did these people need to stay away. That's worked with him. When he went to another town that was very distant, if they offered monstrous, mammoth payments every year, he was happy to just accept that and not rule over them if they made the payments. So I think he had every reason to let them in and figure out a solution that would not bring shame, pain, and political disaster upon him like a huge battle would. I think many people have argued recently, well, but they would have won. There were tens of thousands of them and only a few hundred of the Spaniards. And that is true. But again, a few hundred mounted Spaniards covered with metal clothing and with crossbows and spears could kill hundreds of the Native Americans, even if they were eventually defeated, the few hundred mounted armored Spaniards. And Montezuma could not afford a battle like that. He really couldn't. His people would have turned on him. All the conquered people, can you imagine? If he had, been so obviously shown any weakness against these people. So he let him in, and there was a kind of a fact-finding mission going on there. The Spaniards were asking to see all the maps and all the lists of tribute payments that the Aztecs received, and were very impressed. And then later, some more Spaniards arrived on the coast. And one thing I didn't mention in the beginning is that Cortés did not really have a permit to do anything other than trade. So he wasn't supposed to be doing what he was doing. He knew he was in trouble. At that point, this was months into their stay there, he and some fellows, some companions did literally kidnap Montezuma from his throne room and put him in chains, because now they had a big problem with these newly arrived Spaniards. They needed to be able to say, oh, don't worry that Cortés did something he wasn't supposed to do and didn't have a permit, because he's won, he has complete control over the people. Witness, he's got their king in chains. So that's why he did ultimately grab Montezuma in that way. It didn't work out. There was a huge battle. And although hundreds of Native Americans did die, they did eject the Spaniards from the city. As you might imagine, thousands of people can do, but they took the casualties. It did eventually bring down the Aztecs because they took so many casualties. And of course, the Spaniards who escaped and they had indigenous allies with them, people who had hated the Aztecs and had joined with them, like the Tlaxcalans. Those who escaped camped out between the central Mexican city of Tenochtitlan and the coast and waited for more Spaniards, more ships, more crossbows, more horses, more of everything to arrive, which it did. And so within a matter of months, they were able to surround the entire city of Tenochtitlan and lay siege to it. And they did eventually win the war, as we know.
So how important were epidemics in explaining the eventual subjugation of the people of Mexico at that time?
For a while in recent times, because historians were interested in coming up with an explanation for the conquest that didn't involve European military superiority, for a couple of decades, what we were saying was that it was only because of the diseases that this was possible. Now, Europeans had a much wider menu of diseases because of all the trade and connections between Africa, Asia, and Europe, whereas the Americas were what used to be called technically by anthropologists pristine civilizations, meaning untouched by others. They were much more epidemiologically vulnerable to disease than the Europeans were because they had developed immunities in a way that the New World people hadn't yet. That was going to happen, obviously, after they had contact with the diseases. And what are called virgin populations die in greater numbers because nobody has developed immunities. So it was easy for us to say, oh, that must have been why. However, it's not an adequate explanation. There were many stories of horrendous defeats, military defeats, that occurred long before the first microbe came off the boat. So, for example, amongst Cortés and his men, there was nothing more than a cold going around. When some more Spaniards came later, somebody did bring smallpox, and it did devastate Mexico, but they had already uh, defeated, say, the Mayans and, extracted the peace, the token of peace, the 20 slave girls, etc. Likewise, in Virginia, Pocahontas's people were routed before the first epidemic started, more than 10 years later. Likewise, we wanted it both ways. We wanted to say that the indigenous only lost because so many other Native Americans sided with the Europeans. On the other hand, all the Native Americans, whether they allied with the Spaniards or not, were devastated by disease. So for several months, fighting just stopped during the Spanish conquest because both the Allies and the Mexica were devastated by disease. So it's not as though the healthy Spaniards and healthy Allies were beating up on the only indigenous that had gotten the sickness. So we've created a picture that isn't very logical. There are other scholars at the same time that were creating an explanation that is much more profoundly logical, and it is this. The longer of people are farming people, the more millennia, and we're not talking about years or days, but when you've been farming for millennia, your population grows, various inventions are developed because now you have a leisured class, and you need to organize irrigation and all sorts of things beyond just hunting. So you become more and more powerful. It explains, Rome's ability to defeat people at first. Now, eventually, the defeated people can beg, borrow, and steal those armaments and fight back. Just like China grew so powerful as a farming culture, but eventually Genghis Khan and the others, could beg, borrow, and steal some of those inventions and hold their own. So it's not permanent, but or it doesn't have to be permanent. But when you've been farming for millennia, longer than your enemies, you're going to have more people, you're going to have metallurgy that you can use, ships, compasses, all of these. It has nothing to do with individual intelligence. Nothing. Okay. You become a farmer when it makes sense to become a farmer, and you stay a hunter-gatherer when it makes most sense to stay a hunter-gatherer. Basically, diseases were a factor. There is no question, but they were not the determinant factor. You do see Native American people suffering, with military defeat, even where that is not a factor.
And how important is this legacy of the Aztecs in modern Mexico?
The legacy is very important. And I think the more people around the world and in Mexico know about how smart and interesting and savvy the Aztecs were. And again, I'm not praising that royal family that did those dastardly deeds. I'm talking about them as a culture as a whole. The more people know that, the better. In Mexico, they've dealt with the pain of their reputation as savages by kind of splitting and saying that some of them were actually proto-Christians, very noble men, philosophers wearing cloaks, but then others of them were these dastardly demons that needed to be put down. And that doesn't really make sense and isn't really true. It's a kind of been an expedient that they relied on to deal with having such ancestors, such sort of animal-like ancestors as they are known to be, even though they weren't. So far better would be, I think, an inheritance, a cultural inheritance that everybody can be proud of.
That was Professor Camilla Townsend, Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University. She is the author of Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs. Please find a link to her book in the description. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for joining us today on History from a New Perspective, and we'll see you in the next episode.